Hi everyone, and welcome to our week on theory building. So for this lecture, we are going to be talking about theories, obviously, including the basic components, so evaluations of schools of thought and causal statements and explanations. We're going to look at an example from Furman, which you should read this week, and then hypotheses and what makes a good one. Okay. So where do we stand right now? By now, all of you probably have a research question, I hope so, as well as submitting a literature review that summarizes how other scholars have answered that research question before. Now, what comes next? You are going to start thinking about how your paper is going to answer that research question. And that probably includes what is your paper's theory. Okay, what is your paper's theory? And that's going to be the bulk of today's lecture. Now, first, let's go look at the assignment so you have a clear sense of what you're aiming towards. So, if we go to Paul's 235 assignments and stage 2 theory and hypothesis. In the theory and hypothesis, you begin to make your own original contribution and explain why you think your independent variable causes your dependent variable. So the first paragraph is a transition away from your literature review and a further elaboration of the gap. So in that literature review, you identified a number of different themes or camps or schools of thought, and you identified gaps in that literature and how you are filling that gap with your own original research. So in more detail, please describe again, the gap in that literature and how your research fills that gap. This is really a transition paragraph away from your literature review and towards your theory and hypothesis. So keep that in mind. Now, the causal statement, that's the next 1 to 2 paragraphs. So this is a causal statement of X causes Y. So if you chose a Y question, this is the answer to your Y research question. Or alternatively, if you chose a what effect question, why do you think X has an effect on Y? To be clear, your theory can be really similar to a previous scholar's theory. You don't have to come up with a new one. So don't feel like you need to start from scratch here, okay? Now, this causal statement is pretty much just one sentence, okay? And then your causal explanation is the why, right? This is why this is happening. And then at the end, you have a hypothesis that is just one sentence. It's just one sentence. That's what you are going to be testing. But in any case, back to the presentation. So just as a refresher, what are theories? Theories are tentative conjectures about the causes of phenomena. They are answers to our why questions. Are they always true? No, but they are sort of general simplifications of the world around us that should be true part or most of the time. Okay, but theories provide causal explanations that explain variation in your dependent variable with variation in an independent variable. Now, there has to be variation, but in your dependent and independent variables, you can't just have they only take on one kind of value. Okay, and I'll give you an example in a second. But really, if you're looking at what affects income inequality, and income inequality has stayed largely the same over 2-3 decades in a specific country, that's no variation, right? You have to have some kind of variation. Or if you're looking at what effect does union membership have on income inequality, again, you would have to have some kind of variation in union membership, and you'd also have to have some kind of variation in income inequality, okay? Now, this independent variable is the thing that makes the dependent variable change, okay? This is the cause or the explanation for the change in your dependent variable. If I'm arguing union membership affects income inequality, right? My independent variable is union membership. My dependent variable is income inequality. Now, just as an example, if you recall from earlier on in the semester, we talked about economic voting, which is just when the economy is going well, you're going to reward the incumbent party in power, and when the economy is doing poorly, you're going to punish the incumbent party in power. So In 2008, we have a recession. The Republican Party gets punished at the polls, and George W. Bush loses and Barack Obama wins, right? And that's because they're punishing the party that was in power, the Republican Party, and rewarding the opposite party. And we can think of other examples when the opposite is true, right? Like 1980, for instance, where the Democratic Party, Jimmy Carter, is doing, like, the economy is doing poorly, and the voters punish him. But the basic idea here of the theory is when economic performance is high, when things are going well, the incumbent party is going to get more, right? More of the vote share. When the economy is okay, right? They'll get a middle amount of the vote share, the incumbent party will. And when the economy is doing really poorly, like in 2008, right, or 1980, you're going to punish the incumbent party, right? You're going to punish the incumbent party. But you can see when the economy was doing pretty well in 1996 with Clinton, they rewarded the incumbent there. Or here's another one, Reagan in 1984. We rewarded the incumbent Reagan because the economy was doing pretty well. Because here on the x-axis is income, right? That's the economy. And then on the y-axis is incumbent vote share, right? And so we see a positive relationship between these two. So as income increases, the incumbent vote share also increases. But this is the idea here. When the economy is doing well, the incumbent will perform better in elections. That's a theory. Now, what should be in your theory section? It's really going to have three elements. So evaluation of schools of thought, which we will talk about shortly. We're going to talk about a causal statement and a causal explanation, and then a hypothesis. And just as a refresher, this first element is just about one paragraph. The second element might be 1 to 2 paragraphs. And then this third is just one line, okay? But this should be somewhere around 1 page. Now, when you are evaluating your schools of thought, you want to engage with them one more time. And you might be thinking, this is really repetitive from what I did in the literature review, that last paragraph. That's true. I agree, it is repetitive, but oftentimes these papers are repetitive. So you just want to, like, whatever you did at the end of your literature review, you're probably going to do a rehashing of that at the beginning of your theory and hypothesis. So in that first paragraph of your theory and hypothesis, you want to think about the strengths and weaknesses of all the schools of thought, okay? And you're going to talk about which school of thought you find to be most compelling and why. Okay, now I want all of you to start that theory section with evaluating those schools of thought. And this is going to be one well-crafted paragraph. Okay, you're going to identify where previous scholarship fell short and what gap you think should be further explored in your paper here. Okay, so you're going to be critiquing what previous scholarship has said and say what gap you think you should be contributing towards. Now, be prepared to come up with your own theory, okay? So you can tell the reader what independent variable you identified explains your dependent variable. That's going to be the most original kind of contribution you might be doing, but that is not always the way you need to do it. So common ways that we might evaluate schools of thought, are there any obvious and important cases that a theory fails to explain? So for instance, modernization theory doesn't really explain the existence of poor democracies. Do any schools of thought rely on questionable assumptions? So the rational choice theory assumes that humans are unaffected by emotions, heuristics, and psychological biases. But really we know now in the past 10, 15 years that emotions are actually quite central to voting. And if anything, they're a bit more salient than they once were. Things like anger, anxiety, fear are used quite a bit in election campaigns and used to be like elicited for people. But like you can critique a theory and say like, I don't buy this, and here's why. I don't think that people are always rational when it comes to politics, for instance. Now, and then you also might say, like, is a school of thought outdated in some respects? A lot of the theories from political science are from the 1970s, 80s, 90s, even the 2000s, and you should really be asking yourself, are these still true in this current year, right? Like, This is a very different time than 1995, right? This is a very different time than 2005. Do these theories still hold, right? So in that way, you don't necessarily have to come up with a new theory, but you can ask, does this older theory still hold in contemporary times? Okay, and then this one is quite common if you're sort of a philosophy double major. Are there any kind of logical inconsistencies in any of your schools of thought? Please note, just like I mentioned, you don't have to come up with a new or unique theory for your papers. You can do so if you like, but this is really, really, really not a requirement. You can take a theory from a previous decade or from a previous scholar and test whether it holds in this other situation, okay? Or you can argue that one of your existing schools of thought is really the most convincing answer to your research question. You just need to make a good argument, a good explanation for why you think so. Okay. Now the next part, once you've moved beyond that first paragraph where you are summarizing the schools of thought and critiquing them and outlining your gap again, right? You already did this at the end of your literature review and you're doing it one more time. You get to this next paragraph. So this is paragraph 2 in your theory and hypothesis section. And this has 2 components to it. It has a causal statement. So for instance, higher economic performance causes higher incumbent vote share. It's usually just one sentence, that causal statement here. Okay. And then you have a whole paragraph or maybe 2 that follow. That's the causal explanation. X causes Y, higher economic performance improves the incumbent vote share because. So that causal explanation is your because, okay? Now, here is an example paragraph here. The causal explanation for this theory is that we believe that the state of the economy is causally related to the outcome of presidential elections because voters hold the presidents responsible for management of the national economy. As a result, when the economy has been performing well, more voters will vote for the incumbent. Okay, so here is our causal explanation. We believe that the state of the economy is causally related to the outcome of presidential elections. That's the causal statement, these first 2 lines here. And then our causal explanation, because voters hold the president responsible for management of the national economy. As a result, when the economy has been performing well, more voters will vote for the incumbent, okay? Those last 3 lines here are your causal explanation. I would expect a bit more, like that causal explanation probably needs to be a bit more robust, but for the most part, this is pretty good. Now, a word of warning, this section rarely has citations from other scholars, right? This is not like the literature review. You are not necessarily relying on other scholars at this point. This is more your ideas, which we find our students sometimes find this to be the most uncomfortable section to write because this is your ideas very plainly said. I think that X causes Y because these 3 to 5 reasons. Now, I would say if you struggle with this section, try saying your idea, your causal statement, your causal explanation aloud to a friend, okay? You want to say it aloud because this does need to be pretty straightforward. But let's look at an example with Furman, which you read for this week. So what Furman is arguing here is that our independent variable, does a country receive help in the form of a civilian nuclear cooperation agreement, which, by the way, we have a definition over here. Civilian nuclear cooperation agreements are agreements that transfer technology, materials, or knowledge from one state to another for peaceful purposes. And Furman is arguing that if they do, that country is going to be more likely to build nuclear weapons, okay? So a causal statement here might look something like a country that receives help in the form of a civilian nuclear cooperation agreement is more likely to build nuclear weapons than a country that does not receive help in the form of a civilian nuclear cooperation agreement, right? And this is, just to point out really quickly, this is variation in our independent variable, whether that country received help in the form of a civilian nuclear cooperation agreement. And there's variation in our dependent variable, whether the country ultimately built nuclear weapons. Now, here, if we were to put this in like a pretty figure, which sometimes can help us figure out the direction of things, right? Nuclear cooperation agreements lead to nuclear weapons, or nuclear cooperations agreements, the lack thereof, are likely to deter countries in the creation of nuclear weapons. And so we could come up with a causal statement like nuclear cooperation agreements cause countries to build nuclear weapons. And here is Furman's causal explanation, right? If we are saying X causes Y here, right? This is our causal statement. Nuclear cooperation agreements cause countries to build nuclear weapons. That's our causal statement. Now, what is the because, right? What is the justification that Furman provides? What's the because here? And here it is, right? Peaceful nuclear cooperation and nuclear weapons are related in two key respects. So two becauses. First, all technology and materials linked to a nuclear weapons program have legitimate civilian applications. For example, uranium enrichment and plutonium reprocessing facilities have dual uses because they can produce fuel for power reactors or fissile material for nuclear weapons. Second, civilian nuclear cooperation increases knowledge in nuclear-related matters. This knowledge can then be applied to weapons-related endeavors. Civilian nuclear programs necessitate familiarity with the handling of radioactive materials, processes for fuel fabrication, and materials having chemical or nuclear properties, and the operation and function of reactors and electronic control systems. They also provide experience in other crucial fields, such as metallurgy and neutronics. These experiences offer, quote, a technology base upon which a nuclear weapon program could draw. These linkages suggest that peaceful nuclear assistance reduces the expected costs of a weapons program, making it more likely that a decision to begin such a program will be made. Considerable political and economic costs, such as international sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and strained relationships with allies, can accompany nuclear weapons programs. Leaders may be reluctant to take on these burdens unless they believe that a weapons campaign could succeed relatively quickly. As Stephen Meyer argues, when the financial and resource demands of beginning a weapons program become less burdensome, states might opt to proceed under a balance of incentives and disincentives that traditionally might have been perceived as insufficient for a proliferation decision. Okay, so this is the because, right? They are giving you Furman is giving you the reasons why, right? Technology and materials linked to nuclear weapons programs have legitimate civilian applications, right? And it increases knowledge in nuclear-related matters. It reduces the costs of a weapons program, right? It reduces the costs of creating a weapons program. So Furman is literally laying out for you, right? Like why they think this relationship exists. Okay. Now, if you need a pause, this is a good place to pause because we're going to shift over into hypotheses now. But take a pause if you want one. But otherwise, we're going to proceed with our discussion of hypotheses and what makes a good one, because we're sort of slowly working our way through the first paragraph of your theory and hypothesis, your causal statement and explanation, and then next comes the hypothesis. Okay. Now, if you recall from earlier on in the semester, this is the road to scientific knowledge. You have a research question. You are developing some kind of causal theory. That's where we are right now. You have a hypothesis, right? Something to be tested. What's coming up, right, is the empirical test in about 3 or 4 weeks. We have an evaluation of a hypothesis, which we'll do over in November, and then an evaluation of our theory, whether our theory is true or not. And then finally, we will be contributing more broadly to scientific knowledge. Now, hypotheses are a testable statement. So after you have a causal statement, after you have a causal explanation, we need to formulate a hypothesis. So a hypothesis is an explicit and testable statement that indicates how a researcher thinks that two variables are related. Okay. Now, these should be testable. They're testable implications of a theory, okay? And that testable statement should be true if our underlying theory is correct, Okay. But again, I'm going to say it over and over and over again. It has to be testable. It has to be testable. If it is not testable, then you cannot proceed. Okay. So let's give you some examples of political science hypotheses. Okay. Now we have the theory of economic voting. Our causal statement is higher economic performance causes higher incumbent party vote share. That's our causal statement. Causal explanation might be something like, because we want to reward the incumbent party for when my income is higher, right? I want to reward the incumbent party. I think that they are responsible for the unemployment rate being lower. So I'm going to give them my vote, right? There are a few different mechanisms here that might work. Now, we need a hypothesis though, right? This is just a sort of broad, generic statement that's like talking about abstract concepts. But we need this causal statement to be testable, okay? Something that is testable, and if it is true, then that means our underlying theory is correct. So just as an example, the theory of economic voting, we could have one hypothesis: as the Dow Jones Index increases, the vote share of the incumbent party during presidential elections increases as well. Or hypothesis 2, as US GDP growth increases, the vote share of the incumbent party during presidential elections increases as well. And as the unemployment rate decreases, the vote share of the incumbent party during presidential elections increases. But you can see we had 3 different measures of the economy: the Dow Jones Index, US GDP growth, and the unemployment rate. Okay. And the outcome here is the incumbent party vote share. Okay. It is true across all 3 of them, but please note the economy as a metric was different across all 3. Right? It was different because there are different ways that you can measure the economy. But this is what we are getting at. If you have a hypothesis, the hypothesis has to be in measurable, testable, concrete terms. Okay? Something that is measurable. Now, if we looked at modernization theory, economic development causes democracy. Okay? Causal explanations, right? There are a variety of reasons why we might expect something like this. Maybe it's something about economic elites become on the side of championing for democracy because they think it will benefit them. Maybe it's something like economic development leads to greater education, which improves democracy. There are a variety of reasons. But in any case, we might think through a few hypotheses. As a country's average income per citizen increases, its democracy score increases as well. As a country's literacy rate increases, its democracy score increases as well. These are all facets, right? Average income per citizen, economic development, right? Country's literacy rate, that is also a measure of economic development. And we're looking at probably like a democracy score from Polity or Freedom House. But these are measurable concepts, right? These are measurable concepts: average income per citizen, literacy rates, and democracy scores. We have taken it from these vague concepts of economic development and captured it in something measurable. That's the thrust of the hypothesis. Now, let's talk about, if you have a good hypothesis, it should have the following characteristics. It should be empirical. It should be general. It should be specific. These sound counterintuitive, but we'll talk about them each in a second. They should correspond to the way in which the researcher intends to test the hypothesis. It is testable, and it implies the researcher's unit of analysis. Okay. Now, empirical. That means that you are making statements about relationships between 2 variables. Okay. A non-empirical statement is something like, democracy is the best form of government. This is normative. This doesn't tell me anything about the direction between 2 variables, an independent and dependent variable. This is just telling me that you prefer democracy. I cannot test this. Okay. An empirical statement would be, as a country's democracy score increases, its infant mortality rate goes down, right? That is like likeliest statement that you could say about democracy being good is that it lowers infant mortality rates, but a country's democracy score increases, its infant mortality rate goes down, right? That's empirical, right? You are making a statement about relationships between two variables, okay? It should also be general, right? It applies to many occurrences of a phenomenon and not just one, right? You're not only talking about September 11th, but you're talking about how it applies more broadly to many foreign and domestic terror attacks, right? Like it can't simply be applied to only one instance, okay? So here's a non-general statement. The United States is a democracy because it is a rich country. That's only one, right? Like you've only told me about one country. It needs to be much more broad, right? And it also is not an explicit relationship between the two variables. Doesn't that feel a bit like a statement someone throws off, like the United States is a democracy because it's a rich country? It's like, how though? Like there's not a lot there. Okay, a general statement would apply to many countries, right? And it likely is also telling me about the relationship between the two variables. As a country's average income per citizen increases, that is a measure of the economy, right? Its democracy score increases as well, right? We're looking at multiple countries. It generalizes pretty well. Okay. Now it's also specific, so it should indicate the direction of the expected relationship between your variables and whether it's a positive or a negative relationship. So when your independent variable goes up, does your dependent variable go down, or does it also go up, right? When your independent variable goes up and your dependent variable goes up with it, that's a positive relationship. But if your independent variable goes up and your dependent variable goes down, that's a negative relationship. Okay, so a positive relationship, as X increases, Y is going to increase as well. So as people become a bit older, they also become wealthier, right? As age increases, wealth is also increasing. A negative relationship is as X increases, Y will decrease. So X increases, Y is decreasing. So as individuals become more educated, they will become less likely to believe in conspiracy theories, okay? So as education is going up, belief in conspiracy theories is going down. Okay, now the next one is note the hypothesis should sort of signal to the reader how you're going to be testing the hypothesis. Okay, it specifies if you're using a time series approach or a cross-sectional approach. Remember back to when we were talking about this with your research question. This is when it starts to factor in. Are you thinking about this from a time series perspective, right? A variation across time, looking at the United States from 2000 to 2025, or are you looking at all OECD countries at one point in time in 2024? So an example that's unclear, higher literacy rates cause higher levels of democracy. Okay, this is just simply like, it doesn't quite signal how you are going to test the hypothesis. Is this in countries? Is this in states? Is this at one point in time? Is this one country at multiple points in time? It needs to signal in some capacity that you're using time series, cross-sectional, and like whether it is. Okay, so here's a clear example. So as a country's literacy rate increases over time, its democracy score will increase as well. So this hypothesis needs to signal to me whether you are testing across space, right, cross-sectionally, or across time. This one here is testing across or over time, right? Increases over time. Okay, here is one across space. Countries with higher literacy rates tend to have higher democracy scores. That, again, is telling me we're looking at variation across space at one point in time. Okay, now you might be thinking, why did she put this photo? It should also be testable, okay? It should also be testable. This means that it is possible for you to obtain data that's going to allow you to test your hypothesis. So if I said something like, higher levels of testosterone in a political leader cause higher levels of aggression during international negotiations, And here's Putin. He loves to post pictures of himself like riding horses and without a shirt. It's very odd. But in any case, right? Can I test this? No. Where am I going to get his blood work, right? Like, this is simply not possible. There's no like database of like all political leaders and executives and their hormones, right? Like, this is simply not testable. And I've already like been giving you feedback on your research questions. Like, what do I think is testable? What do I think isn't? And like, this is why, right? Because if your project is not testable, then essentially your paper falls apart here. Okay, you can't complete the research design. You can't complete the results. You likely like bomb the paper because it is not testable. So that's what I'm trying to keep an eye out for you, like when choosing a research question. Finally, it should imply the researcher's unit of analysis. So these are the types of actors or entities that the hypothesis applies to. So is your hypothesis making a statement about countries, states, individual politicians, parties, maybe the electorate, something else? I should be able to infer from your hypothesis what kind of actor, what kind of entity you're talking about. So here are some examples. And this is the unit of analysis. Members of the House who belong to the same party as the president are more likely to vote for legislation desired by the president than are members who belong to a different party, right? Here, I know my unit of analysis is members of the House. Civil wars that are halted by a negotiated peace agreement are less likely to re-erupt than are those that cease due to the military superiority of one of the parties to the conflict. In this case, my unit of analysis is civil wars. And finally, the richer a country is, the higher its democracy score. So there, country is my unit of analysis. I should be able to infer from your hypothesis your unit of analysis. So what we covered for today, the basic components of theories, including evaluation of schools of thought and causal statements and explanations. An example from Furman, you got to see a causal statement and a causal explanation, and I'll post an example with your weekly activity as well. And then hypotheses and what makes a good one. So I've given you a few examples of hypotheses. We'll be working on those over the next week or so. But you should be careful that the hypotheses you have are meeting the criteria laid out here. If you have any questions, please email me, come see me in office hours, especially since the way these deadlines work is we're going to move pretty quickly forward. And if you have any questions about anything, you should start to come see me or send me an email and we can set something up. Otherwise, I hope you all have a good week.